that, okay, I think we are going to get started. We're really excited to have everybody here today because we have been getting a lot of interest from HBSWA members about the topic of board service. This is something that is very much on people's minds, and within the HBS Women's Association community, we know that there are a lot of women who are already serving on boards and many, many women who are starting to think about it. So we wanted to present this evening some very knowledgeable women who are among our membership base and talk a little bit from the informational level. And so we welcome you tonight to talk about Boards 101, preparing to serve on a corporate board. So everyone who's here tonight will be in a different place. But I wanted to just introduce who our two speakers are, because as we get in the conversation, we want to get to know a little bit about you and the folks who are attending tonight and what your background is. But before we do that, I want to mention two things. Number one, we're also very happy to have with us tonight. We have HBS has begun an initiative called the Board Diversity Network, BDN. They offer a newsletter where they are starting to offer content related to board service for all HBS alumni, not just the women in the Women's Association. It's actually all alumni from HBS. So we have Daniela Dennis is joining us today from the Board Diversity Network. So we're happy to have her here. And we will, throughout the chat, we will put the BDN's link so that you can all check that out and sign up for the BDN newsletter. But with that, let me jump right over to our speakers. So I'm really happy to present to you tonight Susan Holliday and Roberta Sydney. So both people that I have been happy to see as members as HBS Women's Association, but also who I know through Harvard Business School's Executive Education alumni program. We attended groups that train for board service through Harvard Business School Executive Education. So that's actually how I originally met both Susan and Roberta. So let me tell you a little bit about them, and then I'll hand things over for them to get the conversation going, and we'll have a few questions to warm things up. So Susan has over 30 years experience in global financial services. She is specialized in insurance and fintech in both developing and emerging markets. Now, Susan has actually worked in several areas of the IFC and the World Bank, and has been a managing director at Swiss Re and served as head of strategy for their global reinsurance business, and also experience as CFO for reinsurance client markets and head of investor relations. So I think you can see Susan has a really great background and has actually made the transition into board service and been a board director in the UK, in Brazil, in India, and in the US as well. She's a graduate of Oxford. She has a degree in modern history, and she completed, as I said, Harvard Business School's AMP program. So she is here tonight to help enlighten us about her path and advice for people who are considering moving into board service. Now, with Susan, we also are happy to welcome here Roberta. Roberta Sydney is MBA alumni from HBS, and she is a very seasoned board director. So she's a former CEO. She has served on both private and public boards. She's currently serving as the board chair for Buckton Holdings, which is a private employee-owned Canadian construction company. She chairs the NomGov committee and serves on the audit committee for Apollo Realty Income Solutions. And her corporate experience before that included senior roles with financial services and money management institutions. So Roberta has had a very strong corporate career and successfully made the transition into board service. And we are going to find out tonight how Susan and Roberta have done this. So I'm going to toss things over to Roberta and Susan by starting with just a couple questions. So ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we're going to have a lot of questions. But before we do that, we want to get to know you a little bit more and how you actually came to be here tonight to talk with us about moving from a corporate career to board service. So I wanted to ask, first of all, about your transition and thinking a little bit about resources and preparation on How did you make that transition to say, now I'm going to start looking into and pursuing board roles? So I'll just start with you, Roberta. I'll pass it over to you and we'll
Sure.
take a couple questions.
Well, before I even begin to answer that, and I appreciate the time and all the interest, because we have a lot of people on the call, I do think it would be good for Susan and me both to know who's listening and who's on the screen. So we had 2 polling questions. They're very quick. I would love if, Alexi, you could put that up. So if you've served on any type of board, and I mean school board, private club board, condo board, YMCA, your church or synagogue, any kind of board, please click yes right now. If not, click no. Give it a few seconds. And then, Alexi, when you're ready, you can show us the answer maybe, and then we'll go to the next question. Okay, 80% have a yes. Wonderful. Next question is, what kind of board, if you put that one up, Alexi. So very easy. You can only pick single choice. I thought we were doing multiple choice. Crap.
Oh, actually, yeah, this one is supposed to be multiple choice.
All right, well, so pick your
Alexa,
highest level. Pick your highest level. If you've served on a public board, pick that. If you've served on a private company board, pick that. And if you've had the experience at this point just of sitting on a nonprofit board, and I'm sorry for using the word just because it is board service, click that one. And when we have enough answers, please show us that one. I have a feeling I would click all 3. So, feel free to pick the highest level. Okay, and our answers are, okay, 57% nonprofit, 37% private, and 6% public. Great. So this means, Susan, that when you and I are answering these questions, we've got some ringers in the audience who we might hear from too. So that's terrific. Well, again, congratulations to all of you for having served on boards and for being willing to share your time and expertise, whether, again, it's a condo board or it's a public company. It all matters, and good governance is good governance. So I know we're going to have a lot of questions today, so I'm going to try to keep my answers short, and we're going to get to as many questions as we can. So in terms of resources and what I did, my career, as Liz just said, was really in corporate America first, and then opening up my own commercial real estate development company. And the only experience I had up until about 10 years ago was either running my own board and sitting on my own company board, which I did have, and my nonprofit board work. So when I decided that I was going to transition from my operating role, that's the word I use, transition from my operating role, not retire, but transition from my operating role to a board role, I got prepared. And one of the things I did was I learned more about what the materials were that you need, which is more than a resume. It is a board bio. And we can talk more about that if people want to hear about that. I did some board education. I did the program that Liz and Susan and I all did, called the Women on Boards course at Harvard Business School. There are other courses too, called the CDC, which is Corporate Director Certification, I think it's called. There are a number of courses of that kind. There are also other courses that I took through the National Association of Corporate Directors. Somebody needs to mute. I don't know who it is, but somebody needs to mute. And then also through the American College of Corporate Directors. In more recent years, I've also done some Canadian courses through something called the ICD, which I have to confess, I don't know what that stands for, but it is the Canadian Director Certification Program. There are other certifications, there are other programs. I've done some cyber certificates and digital director certificates. I know Susan will probably talk about her risk certificate, but there are a lot of these that are available. The most important thing I would point out is it's not going to get you a board seat. It's not going to make you a board director. However, any one of these programs, any book that you pick up, any webinar that you come to, it's going to help you learn the parlance, the language, the kinds of things that are going on in the boardroom, which makes you that much more effective as you're out networking, which is really my key resource, not any of these courses. But you need to understand what board directors are thinking about and how they think about becoming a value add in the boardroom. And I'll leave it at that and let Susan go, and then we can dive into more things.
Sure, thanks, Roberta. So my journey was a little bit different. I was back in kind of the middle of my career. I was an equity analyst covering the insurance sector on a global basis. So I did a lot of work with kind of C-suites and a lot of work looking at company results and analyzing them and looking at like what was happening in their AGMs and who the directors were, dividend policies and all sorts of things. And then when I was my first job at Swiss Re, I was the head of investor relations, where you do a lot of work with the board and particularly the audit committee. For those who don't know, Swiss Re is the world's second largest reinsurance company, and at the time was about I think 29 billion top line and market cap in US dollars. So I'd sort of been kind of in the boardroom as a guest, so to say. And I decided that I was interested in potentially, at some point in my career, joining boards. And so I actually asked them, and I highly recommend people who are in a big company, if this is a possibility for you to do this. I expressed an interest in serving on some of their subsidiary boards. And obviously they knew, the top management knew me, the board members knew me, company secretaries, all this kind of stuff. And they were like, actually, that's a good idea, because they had independent board members on their very big subsidiaries, but they had a lot of other ones where the board members were really the people kind of like in the business. And they're like, we actually want some different views and some people who are not just running that department being on the board. And so a small number of us joined some of these internal boards. And to Roberta's point, they gave us some training, which was helpful. And I was on one in Brazil and one in London, regulated financial services entities. And then when I was working at the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, they will only let people serve on boards of companies they've invested in if it's a corporate board. But I did serve on one, a digital insurance broker in India. Again, they gave me some training. But I decided, because I still had the idea by now, I'm like, okay, I've done this. I like it. Eventually, this is really what I want to do, to again go off and get some training. So I did the Women on Boards course that Roberta is speaking about in 2018, even though at that time I couldn't serve on any other boards. And yeah, I don't want this talk to be all about training courses, but I did also do the corporate director certification at HBS, which is for people who do serve on for-profit boards, public or private. I did the NACD qualification, National Association of Corporate Directors. And the one that Roberta mentioned before, during COVID, when I had a bit of time, I decided I'm a great person for like lifelong learning, to spend some time, like on Zoom, because where else was I going to be? And so I did a couple of courses with the DCRO Institute, which is focused on risk expertise and risk management for board directors. Actually ended up being a tiny little teacher in one of the courses. Yeah, I've done a few of their things. And like Roberta said, I've also done an NACD cyber certification, and nothing directly to do with boards, but very recently, I actually went to MIT and spent a week focusing on AI. And the reason why I mention that is that board training is not a one and done, right? It's not like, oh, we went on Women on Boards course in 2018, woo, woo, right? Because, I mean, there wasn't any Gen AI in 2018, right? And all sorts of other things have changed. So I do believe, last comment, that to be a successful board member, you have to keep up with what's going on, and you have to be prepared to invest time and effort, and in many cases, your own money, in continued professional education. And I think that's something that's important for people to be aware of.
Great. Yeah, I think that one of the things that both of you mentioned with different experiences is just doing the training does not catapult you onto the board. And I think that's really important. That's one of the things that the sooner that you kind of capture that. So with that, what I think is also another kind of entry level conversation that everybody deals with when they start to look at boards is, tell us a little bit about how you prepared the materials. How did you present your board persona so that you could make that transition from your professional corporate lives into presenting yourself as a capable and desirable board director?
Susan, you want to kick that one off?
Sure. Okay, so although I think my stuff's in pretty good shape now, this wasn't my finest moment, okay? So as was mentioned earlier on, you need different documents to be a board director than you need for an executive role. So, you have your CV to be an executive, and if you still want to do executive roles, you need to have that and keep it up to date. For boards, typically, I know a few people have slightly different views on that, but as Roberta mentioned earlier on, you typically need a one-page, what's called board bio, and then a kind of, I call it resume just to be distinct from the CV, but it's kind of like a CV, but oriented towards boards and your experience that's relevant to boards, not what you've done in an operating context. So the truth is, for me, I went through a couple of processes to kind of help me with my documentation. And to be brutally honest, one of them I didn't think was very good. The second one was good, but I was a bit in denial because I'm like, well, I have a CV and a bio is not that bad. And I'd already served on several boards. And then about halfway through the thing, I'm like, oh no, my board bio is horrible, right? Because it was too kind of narrative. It wasn't thematic. And I completely rejigged it and put it into different categories of, okay, this is what I've done. It didn't matter about which year it was, but that's relevant to the kind of functions that I perform on a board, which is a lot around serving on or chairing audit and risk committees. And other experience that I had around governance, or I was involved with a proxy voting situation on comp, for example. That's very useful experience for a board member. But it took me a lot of goes and literally like years to get to having a decent board bio. So it is kind of hard. And people also, everyone you talk to will tell you something different. Right. So you need to, I think from what I learned is I need to be prepared to change and think about it in a different way. But you also don't change it every single day because, somebody tells you to, because it'll just drive you nuts. But I do think it's worth some of the groups, for example, the group that Roberta and Elizabeth and I are in, for the women who've done the Women on Boards course, WEOB. They will help you with this. And there are some kind of like people who specialize in this. While Roberta's talking, I'll put some in the chat that I would kind of recommend, because it is a thing and it's not that easy to completely do it on your own.
Right. I would agree with that. And in all truth, I did use actually two coaches to help me, because I think it's very easy for me to talk about Susan and pump her up and tell you why you should meet with her and consider her for your board. I think it's very hard for anyone, in particular, I think for women, but anyone, to talk about themselves. So getting to the heart of it and understanding that this is your sales document as a tease. Think of it as you want them to want to meet you. That's what this is about. You're not going to put everything in it because otherwise it would be very, very long. But it needs to have a picture. It needs to be a good picture, not a selfie. It needs to have your name, and it needs to have where or how to contact you. And then it has to be writing, can be bullets, can be words, but it needs to be writing about what you bring to a board and the question you're answering. And as you think about it, or you work with a coach or whatever, is if I'm the NomGov chair, or I'm the board chair, or I'm the CEO, and I'm reading this bio on Susan or on Roberta or on Elizabeth, why would I want them on my team? Why do I want them in the precious few seats sitting on the boat called the board, this team, and what are they going to add? And the last thing I would say about this one, we haven't talked about elevator pitches, but the last thing I would say about this one, but everybody remembers the pommel horse guy from the Olympics, the guy who could do one thing really, really, really well. Well, boards cannot afford to have 7 pommel horse guys or gals. They need to have people who are T-shaped. And what I mean by T-shaped is really deep in one type of expertise. I mean, if you need somebody who's going to do audit and perhaps has industry knowledge and insurance, that's Susan. That is not Roberta. That is Susan. However, Susan has breadth. And she is T-shaped because she can participate in all kinds of other conversations, whether it's around compensation or strategy or go to market. And that's what you need in every member of your board. So your board bio has to demonstrate that you can leverage, and I'm using these words very clearly, leverage your operating experience, leverage your other board role experience, bring that to bear to help with oversight, insight, and foresight. You're not there to run the company. I've seen a lot of board bios and elevator pitches for that matter that are very operational. I'm allergic to those as a board chair. I would be allergic to those as a CEO. I would be allergic to those as a non-gov chair. So you really need to make sure that what you're doing is you're showcasing what your superpower is. And maybe it's 2 superpowers, but it's not 20. I've seen board bios say, oh yeah, I can do anything on any board for anyone. Not true, not true. So that, I would say that kind of covers it in terms of resources. And don't ever ask anyone what a board document is. If you're if someone says, oh, can you please send me please ask one of us. Don't ask someone from a board that I've been asked that question. I was horrified. It would completely disqualify you.
I love the real advice, because that does happen where you go, oh, what would you want me to send? Don't do that. Say, yes, I'll send it to you, and then get in touch with Roberta and Susan for help. So this is all such good real life tidbits, because they resonate so much with, what I have experienced and seen a lot of women going through as they go down this path. So I think one of the important things that you asked about in the survey up top is the different types of boards. So we've got a mixed group here, and we do have very heavy on board service, but within that, higher up towards not-for-profit. Can you both talk about, and whoever would like to go first, jump in, but can you talk about, compare and contrast the different types of boards with how that affects your board journey and what you may or may not be preparing yourself to do?
You want to go first, Susan? You want me to kick it off?
You kick it off, and then I'll add on the ones where I have particular kind of experts.
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to scare you all. And by that, I mean any board you're serving on, and I don't care if it's an advisory board, a fiduciary board, a nonprofit board, or a private board, an ESOP board, or a public board, you should take it seriously, and you should make sure that there is director and officer insurance. And if there isn't, or they tell you they can't afford it, they can't afford you. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is I want to scare you and say it takes time to be a board director. And so for those of you who have an operating role now and you're thinking about, well, I think I've got capacity for one board, that's probably all you have capacity for. And it takes, again, I would say somewhere between 150 and 200 hours per year to be a good board director. It is not, I show up at 4 meetings, they take 1 day, I prepare in a few hours. It's more than that. There are committees that you're going to be sitting on. There's homework that you're going to need to do. There are calls that you're going to need to have. And so you need to be prepared for that kind of, again, and it's not evenly spread across the weeks or the months of the year, as you can imagine. It's more related to how the quarters go. So you need to have both of those in mind. With that in mind, I will say that there are differences among boards, but good governance is good governance. I said that earlier, and I think every place you go and every place that Susan and I and Elizabeth go deserves to have great board directors. In smaller companies, and this could be smaller nonprofits, smaller private companies, and maybe even smaller public companies, but less so with the public company, there will be a lot more interaction with more members of management and sometimes a little bit more of seeing what's under the kimono sometimes. With public companies, you really don't get as much of that. And so what I mean by that is there are regulatory requirements. For example, on my public REIT board, we had the CFO resign. Well, that's an 8K filing. That's an emergency call from the chair to say, hey, we need to hold a meeting. We need to discuss this. We got to get this filing. And we have hours and days to do it. Same as if there were a ransomware attack, God forbid, or some other material event that needed to be reported. So there are different ways of participating. I will say that for any good board, I'll just say it this way, any good board will have committees. The 3 committees that generally will be present will be the compensation committee that I know Susan's talked about before, the nominating and governance committee, and then the audit/risk committee. Now, in some industries, you'll have a separate risk committee almost by mandate. In other companies, there might be a technology committee, there might be a sustainability committee, there might be an ESG committee. It really depends on the life cycle of the company as well as the industry and the size of the company. So all of that will really factor into that program, and the nominating governance committee is the one pivotal to figuring out, do we have the right people on the board? Do we have the right committees of the board? Do we have the right committee charters to make sure that all of the things that this company needs in order to succeed are there in terms of the board? And I'm trying to think if there was anything else that I'd like to add. I think I'll stop there and let, because there's a lot more I could say, but Susan, why don't you jump in?
Sure. So let me just add to that a little bit. And also this maybe addresses one of the things I saw in the chat. So when I have experience, I've done work with public company boards, but I've never been a board director of one. So my boards are private, but at different stages. So if you are on an early stage, what I'll generally call VC type company, so maybe with angel investors, venture capital, we're talking about like it, for those of you who know these industries, seed, series A, probably B type companies. They don't tend to have very complex kind of governance structure, so they may not have separate committees. And also you may, in some cases, have to get a little bit closer to kind of like management roles, because they don't have loads and loads of people running around that you do in a bigger company to kind of, you know, do all the kind of tasks. So that tends to be slightly more, notwithstanding that board is not operational management, you are independent, you have oversight, governance, and whatever. But in those type of boards, you sometimes might have to be a bit more hands-on with something, because they may not have a full-time head of HR or risk or whatever it is. When you get to later stage venture capital type boards, which I've also served on, and private equity and private companies, then it starts to get a bit more mature, more likely to have these types of committees that Roberta referred to, but of course could have very different dynamics, right? Is it a company that's continuing to do lots of rounds of fundraising? Is it a turnaround situation? Is it a family company that's perhaps been in the family for years? There are family members on the board and a certain family dynamic that you have to navigate. That's very different from, you know, for example, a PE-backed board. Also, they will be kind of looking for different things. So, for example, PE firms tend to have lots and lots of financial experience, right? They're really good at kind of like financial structuring and, you know, and all that type of stuff. They're not going to hire someone just because they're a CPA or a chartered accountant or whatever. They have tons of these guys who are really good at this stuff. But they might hire somebody because they have sector expertise, or, for example, something like marketing to be a board member. And then when you get to the public companies, yeah, there are a lot more compulsory disclosures that you have to do, both in terms of your kind of quarterly filings, but also, as Roberta said, ad hoc disclosures, you know, if you're doing a profits warning or you have a cyber attack or whatever it is. One other thing I'll just add. If you are in regulated industries, my background is regulated financial services. So most, but not all, of the boards I'm on are regulated financial services. Even though they were private companies, it was more like a public company in some ways, because there's heavy regulatory scrutiny. Even though you don't necessarily publicly have to file things about stuff that's happening, you have to tell the regulator. And the company gets a lot of letters from the regulator, which needs to be addressed, you know, probably by the CEO or chief risk officer or CFO, but the board needs to kind of know about it, asking all sorts of different types of questions. And there's kind of a lot of compliance and all the rest of it. So in terms of the kind of workload and kind of having to report externally and be accountable to kind of like external parties, in that way, I see, as I say, regulated, if it's, for example, insurance company, bank or something, even if it's not listed, in some ways is the work is more similar to, in my opinion, being on a listed company board.
I think that's great. I really want to encourage people to, I know Elizabeth said this before, but if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Please let us know what you want to hear about. I know the thing that immediately came to my mind there, Susan, that I'd love for you to amplify a little bit is, you know, how do you get on these boards? I mean, I know that's one question that I get all the time. Like, how did you get your first board? How did you get that most recent board? And I did allude to this whole idea of networking, but I think that would be something that our audience would want to hear about. Do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. I'm looking for some more boards right now. So I guess this is my networking, right? So thinking about it, one thing I did that, I've done some stupid things in my career. The thing I did that was good that I referred to earlier was getting on the boards of a couple of the subsidiaries of the company I work for. Because then, first of all, you get board experience, you can put it on your bio. You get, if it's a good company, you get some training, but also you find out if you like it or not. Because one of the boards I was on, they were both regulated, but was heavily, heavily regulated.
I know, but how did you get your boards besides asking your company to put you on?
Okay.
Tell us about that.
Yep. So those were the ones when I was on the subsidiary of the company. Which
so how'd you get the latest board you got?
Board experience. Then the other ones, outside of that, a PE board, I knew, to be honest, one of the partners in the PE firm. And we'd known each other for quite a long time. She knew my expertise, experience, whatever. So she contacted me and said, are you interested? And I was like, potentially, yes, but I want to meet the CEO, the chair, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how that
happened. So that was a networking relationship with somebody that you knew from your past.
Correct.
And is that how you've gotten all of your
And then another one was recruiter.
Okay.
And maybe Roberta, you want to talk in a minute about recruiter. So it was a recruiter contacted me, and then there was kind of like a funnel, right? They have a long list, short list, and all that kind of stuff. So that's how I got it. So those are the three ways that I kind of got on. Oh, and another one I knew the CEO. I'd forgotten about that. Another one I knew the CEO.
Okay, so you've not gotten on a board with somebody that you didn't know except for the recruiter.
Correct.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I think this is terrific because my experience is very different, and I think that will be helpful for the audience. And I do want to actually reference, I know that Kim asked a great question about this, so I'm going to leverage that. And then there was another question from someone before that around how do you not sound like you're operational when, what does that really mean? So my very first board, and now we're going back in the way back time machine, back to 2016 here, that was not a board of a company I was running and not one of these other boards that I was talking about, came because I went to a conference. It was called the Private Company Governance Summit. It was in Chicago. And I just thought, well, I'm going to learn something. I'm running a private company. I'm now moving into board service. I thought this will be great. There will be people there. So I went to the event, was very impressed, and I learned about something called the Private Directors Association. I'm not necessarily plugging the Private Directors Association, but I called them up and I said, hey, is there anything going on in Boston, which is where I live? And they said, well, there isn't yet a chapter in Boston, but we're looking to expand our chapter network. And there's someone named Mary, and who I knew Mary through my National Association of Corporate Directors. I said, oh, I'll call Mary up and find out what's going on. So I called Mary. So now I've gone to a conference, talked to the people in the Chicago PDA office. Now I'm talking to Mary, and Mary says, oh, it's not me, it's this other guy, Doug. So now I've got to the fourth branch of my tree, if you will. And Doug says, well, before we start talking about PDA and what's going on or not going on, tell me about you. Now, this is a guy who's a family business consultant. He happened to have a client based in Long Island City. Their company you would never have heard of. They're called Plaxall, but they were the company that brought HQ2 and Amazon to Long Island City. If all you remember that big hoopla when everyone was trying to get HQ2. So that's how I got seated on that board, was through that 4-prong following this breadcrumb trail. Everyone you talk to pretty much that I've ever talked to will have something similar to that. So it wasn't someone I knew before. It wasn't someone that I knew to even try to find to meet that I knew before. It was just going out into the ecosystem of people who are likely to be in the flow. And I think that is way more fruitful than recruiters. Recruiters, by the way, only seat about 10 to 15% of board roles. So to the extent that you are seriously interested about adding value and contributing to a board, I don't think you should spend a lot of time with recruiters. It's like putting your name in the phone book, for those of you who are old enough to know about what a phone book was. It's all good, but unless someone's looking for a plumber and you happen to be AAA plumbing, they're probably not calling you. So I would say that, and nothing against recruiters and nothing against portals. There's one called Him for Her. I think it's called Illumin now. These are great, board prospects, all great places, worth considering. But unless someone's looking for the purple squirrel that you are, which is how boards generally look for people, we need somebody kind of that looks like Susan. We don't know Susan, but we need somebody that has experience in global insurance markets and who understands X and Y and Z. Who do you know? Oh, and by the way, if there happened to be a diverse person, better. But the skill is what we're hiring for first. And you should all remember that. I guess the point that I would make about leveraging, this is to Kim's point and the other point, at the heart of all of this, people are looking for someone who's going to help them make money. Let's remember, it's all about business, whether it's a nonprofit company or it's a for-profit company. You have to be able to pay your bills. Even if you're not trying to make oodles of money for your shareholder, a nonprofit still has to sustain itself and be, fiscally responsible. So if you have experience helping an organization in some way, whether it's a functional role in marketing, whether it's a legal role, whether it's a analytical role, whether it's an HR role, all of those can be helpful to what you've done in your background. And if you've applied it on a nonprofit board, it doesn't matter. It's board experience. I do not like telling people, oh, well, my experience was just on a nonprofit. You have board experience. Susan talked before about how she had significant board experience with working with a board and presenting to a board. That is board experience. Everything counts. And for those of you who live in Boston and know Fenway Park, I will say, if I pitched 1/2 inning at Fenway and then blew out my shoulder or my elbow and could never pitch again and could never play again, I would still call myself a major league ball player. So again, any board experience you have is relevant. And I would try not to describe your board experience in your bio as, oh, well, this was nonprofit board experience. And I can tell you, my first board bio, I talked about handling a breach as a board officer and chair of the audit committee. Now, I didn't say, oh, and it was just on a nonprofit, but it caught people's attention. They go, oh, you handled a breach. Can we talk about that? That's really interesting. What did you do and how did you handle that? And what was the outcome? So I hope that's helpful to people, because there are so many ways, but the most important thing you have to do is talk to everybody with skin. And I know that's everybody with skin that you think is relevant to your board journey. And the last point I would make is before I went to the Harvard program, and I did 2019 was my course. So Susan and I weren't even in the same year. But I thought that if somebody could spell the word board, oh, that would be helpful. Let me meet with them. And what I got was a lot of information on my board bio, a lot of input, like what Susan said, which is not very helpful. When I got very clear, which I did get after I took that course and after I met some fantastic people, like the ones that are sitting around on this call today, what I got from that was, where would you be most helpful, Roberta? Where would you be most helpful? And once I got very clear that my background, my experience would be helpful to a fintech or a company in the real estate or construction space, or a company in doing something with the built environment, it could be alarms, it could be building systems, it could be plumbing fixtures. That's when I started talking to only people in those ecosystems and got traction and built out what I consider a very happy and successful board portfolio.
This is
wonderful. You want to take that next question on the DEI, Susan? Do you see that?
There you go. That's right.
Oh, and then there's one on compensation. I love that question too. Which one do you want to take, Susan?
I'm only, wait a minute, let me see. I can't see the DEI one.
There's one that says women, they don't want women anymore. So what are you doing, basically?
Yeah, it's Jenny's question. She actually has two questions. One about the DEI are we now going to be having the wave go against women getting on boards? But she also, after that, has a question about functional expertise and is marketing less desirable than others, which I think is a broad topic about, are there trends in the functional expertise that boards look for? But the DEI.
Roberta, why don't you kick off on that one? And then I'll have a crack on the compensation one, and you can add that.
Sure. So again, I would say that wearing a skirt sometimes is not going to get you a board seat. Being a Black person or an Asian person is not going to get you a board seat. This is the gravy that boards often want, and having an inclusive board and having an inclusive management team is what I think every company wants. I don't care if they're a nonprofit company or for-profit company. I've heard every every person I know who sits in the C-suite says, we want to make sure that our company looks like our customer, and we want to make sure that our board looks like our customers. So you can't imagine that if you were Avon, that you're going to have only old white guys sitting on that board and have it be credible to the investor community. So I do think there still is a role for an inclusive board. I think the words DE&I have been weaponized. I think there's a whole lot of reason for that, but most companies still want to make great decisions. And it's been proven time and again. There are McKinsey studies. There's all sorts of other work that says that better decisions get made, better conversations get had when you have more viewpoints around the table, more expertise around the table. And so I don't think it's an impediment at all. And what I would say is, if somebody doesn't really want a woman, or doesn't want a Black person, or doesn't want a bi or a gay person, you don't want to be there either. I mean, I wear a Jewish star. You probably can't see it today, but I wear a Jewish star every day. And I've been told, well, why are you wearing that? Some people might not like Jews. And I go, well, then I don't want to work with them. I don't want to work with somebody who's anti-Semitic. So I guess that would be my point, is you shouldn't be covering up who you are, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, skin color, whether you spoke Spanish as your first language. I mean, all of this adds tremendous value to what you bring to the table. So I'm back to you on compensation.
Okay, great. So just one comment, which is maybe a little bit less uplifting, but I agree with you, Roberta. I don't have it on this, but at the moment I'm wearing a Ukraine flag, even though I'm not Ukrainian, because I really, care about it. So one sentence on something less edifying just before we all get kind of totally too excited, and then I'll talk about compensation. I was being interviewed for a board which I'd been suggested for by someone I know who was on that board. I won't give too much information for reasons that are about to become obvious. I was the runner-up, which is absolutely fine. I have no problem with it. I know the person who got the board position. I looked up his LinkedIn, and the guy was qualified. He was also pretty much exactly the same as many of the other board members. The recruitment process was being run by the chair of the Nom and Gov committee, who was very nice woman. And I asked her for some feedback, and the conversation wasn't going that well. And I kind of said, look, I don't mind. I'm not going to get upset. I really want to know how I could do better. And in the end, she said to me, he's the CEO's best friend, Susan. You were great. There's nothing else I can tell you. So I was like, okay, I don't want to waste any more of this woman's time. I think the person is a perfectly competent board member. But I was pretty disappointed. Okay, so it does happen, and let's just kind of acknowledge that. Moving on to the comp thing, I'll start off and then Roberta can add some comments. So it goes back, the reason why I offered to take this one, it goes back a bit to these stages of boards that I was talking about, right? So obviously non-profit, you're not going to get paid, and they might want you to actually give quite a lot of money, right? So that's something to be aware of. I disapprove of non-profit boards where they just want people who give the most amount of money, because I don't think they know anything about governance or necessarily, or finance, or whatever skills you need, but separate conversation. Early stage VC companies tend to only pay in stock. And it usually is stock or options, which because it's not a public company, even if they may end up not being worth any money, because lots of early stage companies fail, and also you can't actually get the money for a long time. And beware, because if it's options, you may have to pay tax on it before you've actually got the money. US continues longer on the whole with stock only than Europe. Europe put independent people and paid them at least partly in cash a bit earlier in the process, but still not till like probably Series B or C. And then after that, you're talking about different mixtures of kind of stock and cash. Again, I don't know how international the group is listening, but believe it or not, in the US, it's quite expected stroke fashionable for board members to get a lot of stock. In Australia, it's illegal because they think it makes them not independent. And there are different kind of cultural norms in different countries, right? One last comment, and then Roberta can add. This question is hard to answer because the ranges are absolutely massive. I know people who are on the board of listed companies, because bear in mind, listed companies range from like the micro caps to like humongous companies like Citibank or whatever. And even the people I know, the pay range is literally from 25,000 a year to 500,000 a year, US dollars. Okay. Which is not super helpful. So depending on that, there are studies published that give more information that's a bit more granular about the type of company size, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a relatively difficult question to answer because the ranges are so wide. And I suggest probably, Roberta, you have different data points to add on this.
Yeah, I would say, first off, if you're asking the question because you're thinking of this as the way you're going to pay your bills, then you really shouldn't be a board director. And you're not really independent because you won't speak truth to power because you're afraid of losing whatever the stipend is. So I'll start with that. The second is, for any public company, I don't care how small or how large, everything about compensation, stock, cash, what have you, how much you get as being a committee chair, board chair, lead independent, it is all in the documents. You never have to wonder, and you never have to say, geez, I wonder if so-and-so is getting paid more than me, because it's all out there. You never ask. You never ask. That's the other thing I would say. I don't care what kind of organization it is, public or private. If you go in and say, well, before I talk to you about being a board director, I want to understand the pay, that's really not something you ought to consider doing. And again, if you really need the money, I would suggest you get a job. Don't think of board service as the way to pay your bills. The last thing I will say, and I think Susan's right, there is a big range. There are a lot of studies. There are comp consultants who do not just executive comp, but also do board director comp. And so they publish reports like this on what are private companies doing? What are public companies doing? What is this kind of private company doing, and so forth. The biggest factor, and Susan alluded to this, is the size of company, meaning the larger the company, the more it pays, period, end of sentence. And boards do look at what percent of revenue the board costs. And so there are stats on that as well. So hopefully that's helpful without giving you, this is what I get paid on this board or that board. I mean, you can look up what I get on my Apollo board because it's all public. Now I see there's another question, and I have to confess, I don't know what the first name is here, but it's around narrowing my focus to certain industries and competencies, and did any classes or programs help? I would say it's my buds and my network that really helped me with this. Because talking to people and saying, when you think of me, you know, like when I would say to Susan or to Elizabeth, when you think of me, what do you think of? What do you think of as something you can count on from me? And when you think about, you know, your industries that you've been in, those are naturals. They're naturals. If you've been, you know, again, everybody's different here, but if you've been a retail banker your whole career, well, guess what? You should probably be thinking about companies that have some adjacency, 2 degrees to the left, 2 degrees to the right from retail banking. That could be, and it could be fintech. It could be a community bank. It could be, you know, it could be a mutual fund perhaps. I mean, there are a lot of things that fit into that. They're not necessarily all looking exactly the same, but I would start with that. That's what I started with because I'd worked both in banking, money management, as well as real estate development. That was sort of my natural starting point. And then it's, what's your functional expertise? Have you been an accountant? Have you been a lawyer? Have you been an HR person? And to the person who asked this question earlier about being a C, I think it was a CMO, but it was a C something. Please, please, please make sure you tout your C-ness, whatever your C-ness is. You could have been the chief risk officer, the chief operating officer, the chief bottle washer. I don't know, whatever it is. If you have a C in your title, claim it on your headline. And the last point I would make too, we didn't cover this before, but if you're serious about board service, please also, not, in addition to thinking about your board bio, in addition to thinking about your board resume that we talked about earlier, really look at LinkedIn and really fix your LinkedIn. It needs to hum and sing off the same sheet, because if somebody hears my name, they hear Roberta Sydney, the first place they're going to go is LinkedIn. That is the first place. And then they're going to say to their pal or buddy or friend, whoever mentioned my name, you know what? I think I would like an intro to Roberta. Her background really looks interesting. So if you don't have anything on there, or if it's, you know, from 3 decades ago or 2 lifetimes ago or 2 sea levels ago, really, you know, think about how you can punch up your LinkedIn so that you look like a director that is expanding their portfolio. And that's an admonition to Kim and others. I think it's Kim, but I don't mean to pick on you, Kim. If you've had any kind of board level experience, you can call yourself a board director. You don't need to say in quotes or asterisk. This is not baseball here. You can say you're a board director. If you were a board chair ever, you can say that. If you were a committee chair ever, you can say that. Just like I use the baseball Fenway Park example.
Susan and Roberta, that actually brings up one really good question that I do hear. We haven't seen it in the chat, but I think it's underlying this is there's probably a lot of people in this community on this event and even beyond this event who are serving still as operating executives. Can you talk a little bit about, and we have about 5 minutes left, so maybe we have time for a couple other questions that can go into the chat, but can you talk about if I'm still an operating executive, but I do want to pursue boards, what does that mean for my approach?
Well, I'll kick it off really quickly and then hand it to Susan. First is get permission. Get permission, get permission, get permission. Do not launch a board effort at all if you have no permission to do so. So whether that's talking to your CEO, talking to your chief legal officer, make sure that you've got permission to do so. And for some people, that means that they can only do a volunteer board role while they're working. For other companies like Susan's, they allowed them to have, you know, another board, a board role. You need to get permission, and you need to get clear on what would not be a conflict, because you have to clear any conflict. You can't go work for your competitor if you're, you know, can't be on the board of a competitor if you're working, you know, nor would they want you probably, but maybe they want you, but you can't do that. So I think that would be the first thing I would say. Over to you, Susan.
Yeah, so I think, and this goes to comments that were made earlier, board work is more time consuming than you think. And they tell you, oh, it's 30 days. It'll be more. I'll guarantee you, I'll do a bet with real money with you. Okay, it'll be more. So bear that in mind and don't be overcommitted. I get really annoyed when I hear about people, oh, I serve on 7 boards, even if it's legal. I'm like, really? Because I'm a fast worker. I work hard. I want to learn a lot. But there are going to be ad hoc things that come up that you can't plan for. And also you do need to do, as we said at the beginning, continuous learning, right? So you need to go on webinars or go to Harvard Business School or whatever it is. So I agree. I think, you know, if you have an executive role, 1 board is enough. And even if you don't, be careful about this idea of, like, you know, 7 boards, because even non-profits are a lot. So the other thing I would just say is, even if you are not allowed, I know like people in investment banks, for example, are not allowed to serve on boards, but if you think it's something you might want to do afterwards, you can start working on your documents, right? And you can start working on your spiel as to kind of like why you would be a good board member, and even seek out in your executive role experience that will help you, like presenting to a board, getting to know board and committee members, that type of thing. So you can get ready, because another thing we haven't really touched on, but the process can be long. It can take years to get on a board, or a number of boards. And then, you know, things happen, like companies get taken over, this, that, then you're not on it anymore, right? So don't kind of think that even if you leave your executive role, some people do, but that the next week you're going to get on a board.
Just muted myself because the dog walker was in taking care of the puppy. I'm at my sister's place, so sorry about that.
Okay. Well, we have one more. I think Amy just put something in. If you guys have time for one more question, advisory board specifically, Amy commented that she's heard a lot from PE
I think
firms.
board service, I think the answer is yes and yes. The thing you should ask yourself about any board role, whether it's advisory or fiduciary, PE, VC, whatever, is, can I add value? Will they appreciate me, not just tolerate me? And do I like the people? And what I mean by liking the people is, am I going to learn something from them? Am I going to be happy when the boat takes on water. And, Susan alluded to this, whether it's ransomware or the CEO dies suddenly, or you have, an Amazon pulls out, suddenly. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why, if you don't feel that the group has integrity, you shouldn't be considering it. I do think, whether it's nonprofit or advisory or small company, all of these are board experience. So if you like what the company's doing, you think they're solving a problem, adding value, filling a need, you think you can add value, it's a great opportunity to help a company. So if you like it, there's no reason not to. But don't think that if you're going to be a consultant, which is kind of what I was sort of reading in the text there, that necessarily will lead to a board role. An advisory board is different from being a consultant to a board.
And just to add to that, whilst, I mean, of course, there are different types of boards. We've discussed that, right? But there are certain basics about boards, fiduciary duty, make sure as D&O, whatever, that are the same for all of them. Advisory board means different things to different people and different companies, right? Some companies will set up something called an advisory board that is just like a group of people that never talk to each other. With others, it's much more like they're operating together, or you might be, advising on a specific type of business, right, or some particular angle to the business. Second quick thing, to go back to what Roberta said early, check whether their D&O covers. I've served on an advisory board. I checked whether I and another lady joining at the same time checked whether the D&O covered advisors and made them prove to us that it did. And by the way, we also got the general counsel on behalf of the company to indemnify us, which was helpful. And it was absolutely no problem. So, you still need to do due diligence with advisory boards.
Great. Well, we have zoomed through this hour, so I would really like to thank you, Roberta and Sydney, for such frank advice. This has been a great conversation.
Susan.
I'm sorry, Roberta and Susan.
That's the problem with two first names. It's the problem.
Exactly. Roberta and Susan, as always, I know your advice is true and from your real experience, but I appreciate if we did not get to a couple questions, we apologize, we're just out of time, but you can always reach out to any of us. And we are looking forward to possibly doing more events about board service. So if any of you here have topics or questions about boards, feel free to send them to me or send them to the HBSWA information email, because we will be looking to pull together more. This is definitely top of mind. So Roberta and Susan, thank you so much. And everybody who is with us tonight, we really appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on a future event.
Okay.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you want us to stay, Elizabeth, or are you